All right. Hope you all can hear me. I just wanted to thank everyone who's joining us here today. I know we are all extremely busy, and fitting another meeting into the schedule is really never easy. So I know, though, this will be a really important discussion for us and extremely beneficial for those of us who are here. My name is Mark Lamas, Jr., and I am the founding advisor for our new initiative called Herbs and Polis. And part of our goal here at Herbs and Polis is really to bring the study of Christian origins to a more public and popular audience, really through sort of palatable mediums like video and live stream like we're doing today. And we're looking forward to really creating more appealing and helpful content that can be used by students, scholars, or teachers in the classroom, or even individuals who are interested but have no sort of educational affiliations. If you want to keep up with the content that we are producing, we really encourage you to subscribe to our blog site. We have all of the stuff listed below, and also follow us on our different social media pages. For all sort of future events that we put on, just know that we really highly encourage you to invite friends and students and colleagues, and just know our live streams are always going to be open to the public for free. On for today, we have the wonderful Dr. Robyn Walsh, who serves foremost as Associate Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at the University of Miami. Dr. Walsh also functions as an advisor and a contributor here at Herbs and Polis. And if you haven't read it yet, she's just recently put out a new blog on our site that is fantastic. I encourage you to go read that when you get a chance. However, today's discussion will really be centered around Dr. Walsh's newest book, which is The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament Within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. That was published with Cambridge University Press just this year. As far as the format goes today, Dr. Sarah Rollins, who is Associate Professor at Rhodes College and also an advisor here at Herbs and Polis, she's going to lead a 30-minute interview with Dr. Walsh. And during that interview, should a question arise that you want to ask, all you need to do is simply add it to the comment section on whichever platform you're streaming from. We're on 3 different platforms at the moment. It'll make its way back to me. So after the 30-minute interview, we've allotted 30 more minutes for Q&A with viewers' questions. And we only ask that your questions be relevant to the content of the interview between Dr. Walsh and Dr. Rollins. I'll be screening those, so I'm watching you. We're looking forward to a really fun discussion. And just note that our first 30-minute time allotment will begin at the start of the interview. So I'll pass it off to Dr. Rollins now. I appreciate everyone who's tuned in.
Great. So thanks, Mark, for doing this. And thanks to everybody for showing up to listen to this conversation. And also thanks for Robyn for being willing to talk more about a project that she's already put so much time into. So sometimes you finish a book and you're like, just go away so I can live my life.
You're right.
I want to talk to you about it for like a year. So that's where we are now. So I did just want to say briefly about how Robyn and I know each other. We've actually been friends for years. And as far as I can recollect, it actually started as some interesting mutual infatuation between a group of Brown graduate students and University of Toronto graduate students. And we would kind of connect at the Redescribing Christian Origins seminar at SBL. So now that we're no longer graduate students and we're like real colleagues, this is pretty exciting. And I had the chance to read some of these chapters as Robyn was in the process of this. And finally, just this week, I've gotten my hands on this beautiful copy. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's tactilely pleasing. I would say that.
Well, one of our friends said it felt like human skin.
Well, so. Yes, which is pleasing in a way, I will say.
Yeah. See, if you just download it from the internet, you don't get, the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I did all my interview prep though with a printed out version of the proof.
There you go.
So yeah. I've put in my work here. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to talk about this project with Robyn. I think it's innovative, bold, creative, boundary pushing, like all the things that we want, right? And we can only get into a fraction of it today. So I would encourage anybody to check out the full book if you have, any questions or want to follow up on these things, because a lot of things that we'll be talking about today are covered much more extensively than we could possibly talk about in 30 minutes. So I'm going to do just like I do with my students, which is let's turn right to the text. And I actually want to start with a quote that I think encapsulates kind of the entire project that Robyn is doing here. It's actually, I think we can put it up. It's on page 169 of the book. So we'll put it up. I will read it and then ask Robyn to kind of reflect on this. So the quote is, "The myth of origins that Christianity tells itself about itself persists. The teachings of Jesus passed on orally from illiterate eyewitnesses in Galilee to spontaneously formed and widespread communities of early Christianity." So I'd like to turn it over to Robyn to kind of unpack that a bit for us.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Sarah, and thanking Mark for giving me this platform to talk about the book and some of my larger theories about the study of early Christianity in the New Testament. I really do appreciate it because I enjoy these conversations a great deal. So to anybody who's watching, please send in questions, and I hope that this really ends up being a collaborative discussion with those of you watching and also with Sarah. And so thank you also, Sarah, for preparing and for reading the massive document that you just produced from, I don't even know where. It seemed like it came out from underneath your desk. So thank you for that. Yeah, that quote, it's funny when you see your own writing out of context. I don't particularly remember writing that sentence, but it does, I think you're right, sort of underline the overarching thesis of the book. What I was trying to get at in the book is, and I should say that the book does take kind of a broad view of the study of early Christianity. And so I'm targeting the specific approach that has persisted for generations within the field, that the Synoptic Gospels in particular, and we can talk about the reasons I selected the Synoptic Gospels at some point in this conversation perhaps, but that these canonical Gospels are derived from some kind of oral tradition that goes back, depending on which scholar you're thinking about, either to the foot of the cross or perhaps to a generation or two after Jesus. If you think about Luke's preface, he talks about talking to people who had talked to eyewitnesses, that kind of thing. So that description, which is highly rhetorical and one that I think is historically dubious, to be frank, has persisted, which is interesting to me because it does seem to be, as I say here, the myth that particularly in the 2nd century and beyond, Christianity tells about its own origin story. And so one thing I wanted to look at in this book was, why have we accepted that origin story for early Christianity in the way that we have? Because when you think about allied fields like classics, you really don't have, and we can talk about some exceptions in Homeric studies or the study of Aesop, you don't really have this claim that oral tradition undergirds the majority of content within a particular kind of writing like the Gospels, and there's all kinds of implications for the historical Jesus as well. And you also don't tend to have rhetoric about communal authorship. Now, what I mean by that is, again, broad-based in the field of early Christianity and New Testament studies. We tend to ascribe authorship of the Gospels either to a community, often the word church is used, so the Matthean community, Markan community, etc. Or there's this idea, and sometimes these things overlap, that there is some kind of literate spokesman that is hired by the community or is a member of the community and happens to be like the one guy in town who can read and write, which is a reflection of how rare it was in antiquity for someone to have the literacy necessary, the paideia and the training necessary to produce any kind of piece of creative literature that includes all kinds of cross-references, references to scripture, references to other kinds of literature, character development. That kind of writing is fairly sophisticated, for antiquity, and just in terms of numbers, we know that it would have been a limited scope of who would be able to produce this, and so that historical reality is sometimes reflected in the idea of the literate spokesperson. So beyond the concerns I had about replicating rhetorical constructions of the origins of Christianity from the 2nd century and beyond by taking the Gospels literally, or taking church rhetoric literally, my other concern was this idea of the spokesman. I wanted to, or spokesperson, to go back to figure out where did that come from. If this is so idiosyncratic to our field, again, when you think about allied fields in the secular university that have different approaches to authorship in antiquity, understanding it more as a autonomous author, or at least a rational agent, more so than somebody who's expressing the views of a cumulative, of a community or a culture of a people. When I looked back and tried to figure out where does this come from in the field, this methodology, I went back to German Romanticism, which is no big surprise because I'm actually thinking about a former student of mine just started graduate school, and she texted me yesterday, why do I have to keep reading all of these German theologians? And I said, well, because the field really, we're only a couple of generations away from the likes of, Martin Heidegger. And so not only does our field have strong roots in theology, that surprises no one, but it also has roots in the Romantic movement, and specifically the German Protestant Romantic movement. And there are certain reflections there that I try to get at in the book that I think can inform where we've come to in the field in terms of the persistence of this methodology of the spokesperson. In particular, the example that's the easiest for me to give is the Brothers Grimm. Almost everybody knows them, and what they did was go around these elite guys collecting the so-called oral traditions, the oral stories of the German people, and that these stories represented these people in some kind of essentializing way. Well, I see that as a very, very similar methodology to what we do in New Testament studies. And what I do in the book is identify how those who are working on the oral traditions of people in a nationalistic sense in post-Enlightenment and Romantic context tended to also be the same people who in the next turn would also work on the Gospels and early Christianity or New Testament, or what we consider the critical study of these texts. And so while other fields have abandoned that long ago for all of the reasons that it has political implications, it's a faulty methodology sociologically, I feel like our field has had a little bit of trouble shedding that. So consequently, back to this quote, that myth of origins persists. And I wanted to test it in this book and see where it came from and see if it holds up to historical analysis.
All right, excellent. So, I mean, that's going to set us up for a lot of things that I want to talk more about, because this sentence is full of just topics that I want to keep unpacking. So one of the things that you did in this first answer is say, like, here's the idea of authorship that I think is not realistic. The idea that there's like one guy in a church who is writing the story of Jesus in a way that embeds his community's, values and feelings or whatever into the story. So I want to ask you then about what the sort of alternative model of authorship practice is. So when these texts are being written, what is it that you think that we should know about how these writings came about that is not this older model?
So I want to preface that many people in our field have recognized that, for example, the gospel authors are citing other kinds of, let's say, for one example, philosophical literature. So one of our colleagues, Aaron Roberts, has written convincingly on this, on, for example, Matthew's use of Stoicism. So we know that this is the case. And so I'm not the first person to make any kinds of claims about how to situate these gospel authors historically as authors in terms of the trajectory of Greco-Roman literature. What I think has been problematic is not that, although I do talk about that in the book, but the degree to which, by postulating something like a spokesman or an author that, as I said before, is not a rational actor, my fear is that if you ascribe authorship to community, to these circles of culture or a group of people, you lose the degree to which, as a historical act, and I don't think this thunder, if you can hear it outside, is directed at me, but you know, when I say something, you know, about religion and thunder claps, I'm gonna get a little nervous. But it's authorship as a historical process and as a material process has all kinds of constraints that I think we need to be attentive to in the field that heretofore I don't know that we have been. So you have to have a certain access to, again, paideia in education, a certain access to actual technical materials, access to other kinds of literature that you have used to learn the trade. You're probably part of some kind of social or economic class, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're high elite. High elites can be illiterate, but you're in some kind of class that would allow for that kind of social and cultural access. Most likely you are constrained, or you absolutely are constrained to some extent by what we would call genre, although there's some debate about whether that term applies to antiquity in the same way we tend to use it. But nobody is going to invent something from whole cloth. Out of nowhere, you're going to have all kinds of historical points of reference within the literature itself. And crucially, authors have conversations with other authors. And so while I don't know exactly what an early Christian group looked like, that they're even there, right? Gospel of Mark, I'm not sure anybody's there, but the author we're calling Mark. I mentioned in the book that that text is the most difficult to pin a Markan community, unlike, say, the Matthean community, where scholars might be like, oh, well, they have broken away from the synagogue, and et cetera, et cetera. Mark is much harder to do that. It exposes the idiosyncratic nature of this kind of method. But I don't know what's going on, if those communities are there or what their influence is. What I do know is that if you're writing in antiquity, you had to have a community of other literate specialists who would be part of that process of writing, part of the process of composition, part of what we would call the publication process and the dissemination process of that writing. That's the group I'm trying to get at in the book. So one misconception I just want to head off at the pass is that I'm not trying to replace a postulated Christian community with an authorship community. That's not at all what I'm trying to do. I'm also not entirely trying to dismiss the idea of oral tradition, or that there are other Christians that these authors knew, or even that the term author might not encapsulate more than one person. But what I'm trying to get at is that there's a very specific historical circumstance that, while I can't tell you anything else about the historical situation of the author of any of these Gospels, I can tell you what an author had to have in their toolkit and had to have as their social historical context to be able to produce anything like we see when we read the Synoptic Gospels. So again, I want to be careful, you know, I'm not trying to call out the whole field. I am speaking kind of in broad strokes, but our tendency to adhere to things like oral tradition and communal authorship, I think, have got us in trouble historically. Because basically it becomes a Rorschach test. Like you see in the ink blot anything that you want to see if you dismiss it from these other historical elements.
Cool. You said two things there that I want to keep pushing on. So I'm going to go in, I think, slightly different order than I'd originally planned. So we are going to come back to oral tradition and talk about that, because that's very important in our field. And I think a lot of people still debate the extent to which that was there. But so you were talking about like a community of writers, and that's really the community that we have access to. Can you describe what the community is that you're like the kind of community that you're pushing back against? Like when people say Matthew's community or John's community, why is that a problematic way to talk about these texts and how they were used?
Well, here I actually want to refer to someone who has written on this in a way that became a foundation for my own writing. My dissertation director, Stan Stowers, and he has an article on the concept of community that goes in much more detail than I go into in the book, because I'm standing on his shoulders to some extent, and it's a predicate for what I do in the book, on the history of the term community itself. We have a colloquial use of the term community in English in contemporary writing and speech that is not entirely attentive to the way that that word came into use in the field and how it has perpetuated, and its connections to a totalizing sense of what we might even call conversion, but a totalizing sense of membership within a group. And this has had all kinds of implications for things like Nazism and fascism and a long history. So I really recommend people, he focuses a bit more on the French side of things. I focus more on the German. But I really recommend people go back and look at that article. It's a few years old now, because it really informed how I saw this, and then I use that as a springboard, especially in my second chapter, to talking about the concept of community. But it's too amorphous. Again, it can end up becoming anything you want it to become, because if you assume the community is there, you assume the community is religious, you assume that it's totalizing, you assume that it's cohesive, and you assume that it's the prime motivator for the authorship of any of these texts, or the prime inspiration for the content of these writings. There are so many things that we potentially miss. First of all, I don't know why we assume that they're there. Otherwise, I just don't know. Or again, historically, we know that authorship communities would have been, just in terms of formative, I don't necessarily even mean like the first person they go to, but the more formative community, if we're going to use that term, would have been other literate producers, not illiterate, groups of Christians in some kind of, huddled together in a church, which in itself is a fantasy of Christian origins, that the other members would have been.
In part, some of this must be based on just our modern sense of what religion is. Like a bunch of people who adhere to X number of doctrines come together and look at text for a couple hours a week, and then they go away. And that's a community.
Again, I can understand why some people might push back. Well, sense of cohesion. I mean, obviously Paul had problems, for example, and maybe there's not cohesion in Matthew's community, and that's why. But why do we go to the religious community first? We're not doing that for any other ancient author. If we're talking about an ancient author and what we would call the field of classics, how many of us are worried about, Cicero's religious community before dictating the content of his writing? That was just kind of off the top of my head, but you understand what I mean. I think that it's something that serves present interests, but maybe as a historical matter is not the direction that is the best starting point for our analysis.
I think our field has, and I mean, I'm not saying I haven't done this or had these thoughts, but like we've had a tendency to do a mirror reading in text and say like, this is what's going on in the text. Oh, someone's being kicked out of the community or kicked out of the synagogue in John's gospel. Therefore, that must have happened somewhere.
The other thing it does, and I say this, I use this word a few times. I know I use it in the introduction, and I actually just wrote a response to an interview with Willie Braun on origins where I bring it up again. But the idea of postulating a community behind, or positing a community behind every single text, allows you to have what we would call like religious pluralism or religious diversity in a case when maybe it wasn't that widespread and diverse. Mm-hmm. So it also not only constructs a myth of origins for Christianity by making these kinds of claims, but it also allows us to, what I call in the book, have an early Christian big bang. Jesus comes and then boom, everybody understands it, they convert, they form little cohesive groups, they start producing their texts, and a miraculous degree of social formation that really does stretch credulity when you think about how new religious movements start.
And I think something that would align like really well with what you're saying and locating this tendency in German Romanticism, maybe even a little bit earlier, would be how people started to talk about religion in the Protestant Reformation. Because as soon as you get theologically distinct ideas there, then you've got a new group, right? You get these breakaway groups that differ simply on doctrinal propositions. So I think in that mentality, it's very easy to look to the past and say, oh, here's a text with X different ideas. It must be a new form of Christianity.
I actually, there are so many different drafts of a book, like this wasn't my title. There's a chapter that was thrown out, you get reader reports and you have to change so many things. And it was really not the penultimate, but it was close to the end. I was working on the chapter on German Romanticism, and it clicked for me that part of this is also anxiety about Catholicism among Protestant scholars. That's actually why I start the book with Volkmar. And because I just saw him as a very sympathetic figure after a while, because I think that the idea that the Gospels could have been produced by these decadent elite Romans who, are basically, if you imagine a trajectory from elite Roman authors to something like the papacy and Protestant imagination during the Romantic era, you can't have your early Christian authors be part of that kind of elite decadent class. They can't be products of Rome. They have to be products of the folk. And so I think that's something that political that we've replicated in our scholarship.
Yeah. In that sense, I mean, this book has a lot of implications that I think people will need to wrestle with for the whole anti-empire thesis about early Christianity. All these books written that they're resisting the Roman Empire and stuff. And maybe that itself is a rhetorical trope that the empire used in its own cultural production.
Absolutely. I'm more and more convinced by that. And it was certainly, whether you loved Rome or hated Rome, as a foil, Jesus makes an excellent foil to imperialism. And you can be in the room and still make that kind of claim rhetorically as a writer in antiquity. You don't have to be outside of it.
I'm keeping my eye on the time. Let's talk about oral tradition for a few minutes, because this has been a problematic category, because sometimes it's a get out of jail free card for where a tradition comes from. Oh, it must have been oral tradition, if we can't come up with a good reason for somebody to have invented a written tradition. I was just reading something in a book about this where somebody said, well, we can't think of any reason to make this up, so it must have circulated independently and goes back to Christ or something like that. So I guess my question put bluntly is, why have biblical scholars been so obsessed with oral tradition through the years?
I mean, even I have trouble letting it go, because I don't want to upset anybody. And certainly, what do you mean by oral?
Do we have evidence for it? I mean, so I think we need to admit that, yes, early Christian followers of Jesus, whatever language you want to use, told stories. Do we have evidence for that? I guess is the
yeah, so that I was going to say, it kind of depends what you mean by oral tradition. I don't want to throw out the idea that there were oral stories circulating that these authors may have heard somewhere, because again, that's not my point. The point is not to say that there isn't maybe some kind of religious community in the purview of what we would call a religious community or even a Christian community. It may just be that that's not the most formative community in terms of the content of these writings. So I want to be careful about that, but I think the way that oral tradition tends to be, again, broad strokes in the field deployed is, what evidence do we have for, think about the Jesus seminar. What evidence do we have for the original sayings of the historical Jesus that go back generation to generation in these debates about, are they, the word for word sayings of Jesus and that kind of thing? I don't think we have for it. I understand its function as a rhetorical move, as it's very uncomfortable that our earliest evidence, as far as we can tell, is Paul, seeing as most of the details Paul has about what we call the historical Jesus were from divination experiences that he had privately, best we can tell. That's not a great way to hang your hat on the authoritative teachings of a long gone, teacher figure and wonder worker. So I think that's something we have to continue to contend with. It's something that is not new. There were scholars during the German Romantic period who also struggled with this and debated against it. Volkmar, again, suggested that Paul actually was the motivation and the model for the entire characterization of Jesus in the Gospels. And it's something I think to consider. He was ostracized for that, and we'll see what happens to me. You do have a guillotine necklace on today, but it's that kind of questioning I think is important for us to do. I'm not sure we understand any longer why we invoke oral tradition in the way that we have. I mean, as you know, and I know we're a little tight on time, so sorry for the personal going down this avenue, but you know, I'm married to a poet, and he's pointed out to me that in the history of oral tradition, very rarely do you have prose. And I know that there are arguments to be made about ways that you can reimagine some of the sayings of Jesus to have been memorized in different ways. The thing you have to be careful about in that case is that often those kinds of claims about how ancient minds worked also come from romantic thinking that's not scientific and ahistorical as well. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, on this particular topic.
And I don't think it's too much to say that when it comes to oral tradition, there's a lot at stake here, right? I mean, this is the link to Jesus in many cases. And without it, if people don't kind of bracket like, well, there must have been a period of oral tradition, then that's a dangerous gap of emptiness. And I think we I think in our field have a kind of more danger for that sort of thing than, say, you know, somebody who's dealing with another historical figure, Augustus or something like that, because what's at stake is, you know, 2,000 years then of religious development on the basis of those sayings. And I don't think enough people admit. I mean, I know plenty of people that will admit that, but I think a lot of people don't realize that's going on in their thinking is sort of what's at stake there.
Well, I'll say this, maybe we hang too much on it, right? So maybe that is something, again, as well, is, you know, how much burden do we ask the concept of oral tradition to bear in our field, and is it too much given our historical evidence?
Yeah, and I think you rightly point out in the book that claiming to have received something through oral tradition or an anonymous tradition or whatever, that is a motif itself in the writings, right? Like that is a way of authenticating something that we see in ancient history writings. And honestly, I mean, when I think about that, when it comes to somebody like Paul, who says he received stuff that was passed down to him, how do we know he's not just making that up and prefacing it with that so that is his authenticating trajectory? I mean,
authors do it all the time, and it seems to me to be an interesting question rather than take that testimony for granted as historically reliable, for us to do more work to test it, because even in their anonymity, the gospel authors are deploying a certain kind of strategy, authorizing strategy. Mm-hmm. And so that in itself is something that needs more scrutiny. So, in classics, we do recognize that in itself as a strategic act.
So I do want to remind folks to send in questions. There's, I think, a couple that are interested in here, and I guess maybe I should at least bring one of them into the conversation since I've written a book on one of them. One of the questions is from Jennifer Isle. Can we put that up? I'm not sure. The question is, where would Robyn place something like Q or sayings gospel in this conversation? So what kind, is it the same kind of writing, I guess, is the question.
There was originally a chapter about Q in this book, and I was told to take it out. But what I suggested in that chapter is, okay, so if Emily Schmidt is watching, you know, I understand Q is hypothetical. And so there are some people in the field who, you know, don't particularly enjoy. Sarah, you should definitely, I'm going to end up, you know, walking out on a ledge here. But, you know, to talk about Q ends up becoming in itself a very debated subject, just because we don't necessarily, you know that it exists. And so I'll say that at Q, for example, signals exchange between authors. One reason that I selected the synoptics is because they were a perfect example of writers in conversation with one another in the kind of cohort that I'm trying to posit in terms of authorship model. I think that, so Q, to me also, though, and the chapter that I wrote in the book that was removed but has since been published in a Redescribing Christian Origins volume on Mark, of all things, is that it was post-war. And I think that there is enough evidence in it in terms of the content and the allusions to say that it was post-war, not pre-war. So it can't, in that respect, represent the sayings, traditions that are otherwise missing from what we might call oral tradition. If it is post-war, the only one to argue this, then it would again be part of this normal kind of literary exchange that I'm trying to identify. And I'm trying to draw the parameters of. The other thing is that there are scholars who have suggested that Q as a hypothetical document, or hypothetical, I don't like to use the word source, but as a hypothetical kind of writing, might in itself be a romantic fantasy, because the idea of picking apart these writings to such a degree that you can reconstruct another entire writing that then represents the oral tradition thesis is a little too convenient. So I start the book with discussing Jefferson's Bible, in which he does something very similar, but closer in time to our present day. So I'll just say, I'll lay that out on the table, and I feel foolish talking in front of a Q scholar about these things. I mean, yeah, so I would love to hear what you have to say about it.
Oh, well, the fun thing about Q is that since it's hypothetical, you can never be wrong because you're always open to more reconstruction, right? I mean, I think Q is a great thing to talk about here because especially with these issues of community and oral tradition, because you can just really see it in some of the older scholarship on Q, because, you know, people who made arguments that, oh, we have a Greek version, therefore we can back translate it into Aramaic and what Jesus would have actually spoken and stuff. I'm one of the people who thinks that the reconstructed version of Q actually shows signs of written Greek, like there's things that you do with the language that you would do in writing, but not necessarily speaking, from my understanding of it. But also the community thing, you know, people have tried to construct Galilean, you know, Q community that
everything
somehow
is a community.
Yeah. Yeah. And then people start looking for like rituals of the Q community, and it's just it's only 256 verses or whatever. Like, you can't expect, you know, anybody to sort of distill their whole livelihood in this kind of text that's fragmentary, right? Of course. Anyway, that was my soapbox just for a minute there. It looks like Greg Carey has a question that goes back to Paul, and also agrees that he'd no longer like to use the term community to talk about his audiences. Maybe we can talk more about that, like what is the way of talking about Paul's audience? But I guess the question is it so clear he's disconnected from earlier traditions? And I'm guessing that means they're like traditions that come from Jerusalem, perhaps, or, you know, these early stories about Jesus, or how do you read that?
So I love this question. I definitely am of the mind that certainly something like Galatians, Philippians, there's evidence there, you know, despite the fact that he tells the Galatians he hopes the knife slips, that he more or less gets along with them, and that they're more or less receptive to the things that he's saying. But it's very clear he's not the only game in town. And obviously Corinthians ends up being sort of the poster child for this. The Romans, he never even met them. So the idea that there are cohesives for each one of these Pauline letters, I think, performs the same mistake that we've been talking about when it comes to the Gospels representing communities. And so then again, it starts to expose how the word community is misused in our field. And that's the primary objective of the book. Section in the first chapter where I talk about hero Paul. And that's an idea that in the 2nd century, we mythologized Paul in such a way as a founding figure because we needed one. We meaning if I'm pretending to be a church father. So let me just be clear about that. But maybe also rhetorically, to some degree, the field may have replicated this, you know, by accident or just by accepting tradition on this, that, you know, from this founding figure. 2 things I want to say about that. One is, I mean, he did write it down. That makes it very convenient, but it's very unclear to my mind from his letters exactly what we would call earlier tradition in this case, particularly because he's obviously in competition with a number of other actors in this period, but also because much of what we might call tradition, with the exception of a few sayings that he's heard Jesus there's one about adultery, for example, beyond his, conversations about Peter and James and the Jerusalem Council. There's really not much to go on. And the thing that I'm thinking about, I can't help myself but mention, again, the piece that I just wrote in response to, for Religious Studies Project, on Willie Braun's very interesting interview on Christian origins in his new book. The Last Supper, what we call the Last Supper, Paul describes it as a divination experience that he had, that Jesus told him in a divination experience what went on. If you look at the NRSV, the HarperCollins Study Bible, and you look at the notes for where it's replicated in the Synoptic Gospels, it says this must have been an oral tradition that stems from the beginning of the church. Paul is explicit that he got it from the Lord. From the Lord does not mean that it came from a long oral tradition that he's a part of, or liturgical tradition that he is a part of that does not exist. There's a gap with like wind. It's just, like hollow space. We just don't know what was there, because by his own testimony, his authority is derived from divination experiences, from pneumatic demonstrations, and from a different kind of demonstration of power, not from a received tradition that he is beholden to.
That, the mention of the word tradition, I think, is just another one of these words that like we just throw around and we don't know what we're doing with it, and it doesn't mean, we just make it mean whatever we want to. And I think it smuggles a lot of baggage in, because to talk about traditions that he might have come from the Jerusalem tradition. Well, what are these? Are these things that he's heard? Are they things that they had endorsed even? And then of course to make the mistake of not even believing Paul when he tells us where he gets something from the divination experience versus other things. Versus,
and I can't. Oh, sorry to interrupt, but I can't. She just asked a question, but I can't recommend John Isles' work enough on this subject. Her most recent book on Paul and divination demonstrates that his, again, authority comes from a very different place.
Okay, let's look at some other questions here. There's a question about from Adam Davis or Davison. There might be two, and I'm not sure which one's which. They're both similar, so I'm just going to read what's on the screen. What about context and motive? Who had the most to gain from producing literature to aid the classification of the East? We know that Jews were at war with Rome. Rome won, and then the New Testament emerges. Realization is controversial, but cannot really be ignored. Do you agree with the last part of that?
Yeah, there's another part of the book that I had to take out because it was too long. That was published by Robert Miles in a volume on class struggle in the New Testament, on what I've called Judean captive literature. And the interest is particularly among Roman elites, both in literature and in material culture, and what we might call far-flung places in the empire, and particularly those at war with the Roman imperial system. There it is. So that includes Germania, it includes Judea, includes all these other territories that we already know a great deal about, the Gauls, etc. And so just a couple of things. One is I don't want to endorse a dichotomy in which we don't understand the Jewish people as being part of that fabric of the Greco-Roman world and even the Roman elite. That's definitely not the case. But the general interest in Judea, particularly in the Flavian period, I think is something that we can't underestimate and something that I'd like to explore a lot more. But there's a great deal of literature, again, by elites, and I referenced this earlier, but whether you like the empire or you hate the empire, to use the Judeans as a foil to talk about either how great Rome is, that they're bringing peace, the Pax Romana to the empire, or how awful they are because look what they do, to all these poor people when they come in and subjugate them. That subject matter is, I think, rife in this period, and one that you would have a lot to gain, even if you are a Roman elite or part of what we might consider a Roman elite or aspirational class in this period, to use that as a starting point for thinking about the role of empire in this period.
Okay, so questions are still open for folks coming in, but I did want to just actually jump in because when I looked at the title, so the title of that essay you were just referencing was, let me make sure to get it right.
I think I called it Judean captive literature in that one.
The Gospels as Imperial captive literature.
Imperial captive
literature. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that reminded me, of course, the last chapter of the book, what we're talking about is where you describe the Gospels as subversive biography, which is a kind of interesting genre that a lot of people don't talk about when they talk about the sort of genre of biography that sometimes the Gospels is placed in. So I wonder if you could just take a second and kind of tell us what subversive biography is and what about it from the Gospels do you think makes it fit that?
Well, the idea is one that I like when in these interviews an author talks a little bit about where an idea came from. I think it's always interesting to hear the genesis, and I think it's informative too for an audience because you can double check me to make sure that I don't have any bias that I'm not aware of. But the idea came from a reader in Latin that I did with David Constan while I was a graduate student. And I translated Apollonius, King of Tyre. And so in the course of translating that with him, I actually did put him to sleep a few times. It's not his fault. But, I would sit there, reading Latin to him. We started talking about this idea of wonder working and other wonder workers in literature of this period. And Alexander the Great ended up becoming a touchstone for our conversation. Not only, it might seem like a stretch to go from Apollonius to the subversive biography genre, but we were talking about in those conversations what he has called an open text, meaning that there are, in this period, you have kind of a rise of a type of literature that is not quite at the elite levels. I use Bourdieu to talk about this in the book, but not at the most elite levels like a Virgil, but the paradoxography, the Roman novel, the Greek novel, other kinds of spells, cookbooks, commentaries, biographies of various kinds start to emerge for this new readership. And you tend to see more of these underdog figures start to emerge. So Alexander becomes the touchstone because you can have the great biography of Alexander the Great, where he's a great hero in the traditional sense. But then you also have the Alexander romance, where he's a complete underdog. He's not attractive. He gets by on his wits, not his physical strength, and by his ability to outsmart everyone around him. And so it ended up becoming a co-authored article that we did together that became the genesis for that chapter in the book, to talk about if you do, again, treat these gospel authors as normal authors, meaning in a traditional historical context, that you might miss some of those comparisons or those trajectories, to the extent that if you persist in the idea that the Gospels are somehow other or somehow exceptional, or incidentally through methodology and discourse construct them as exceptional, then you might miss that kind of comparison. And so Jesus just, if you consider him a kind of biography, which many people have, if we're thinking about genre classification, then he's another one of these underdog figures, and it fits very securely within this kind of class of literature that actually relates to the last question about imperial captive literature as well.
Yeah, I just like the word subversive because I think it's really provocative in the sense that something is always subversive to somebody else. So that really asks us to look at whose values are being presented and what's being subverted. And that, I think, gets us not to, illiterate peasants, but it gets us to a different group of people. Okay, very good question, actually, that just popped into the chat from Emily Schmidt, who is interested in hearing about how these ideas of authorship and community can shape the way we teach undergrads, including those who aren't going to be majors, right? So this is pretty heavy stuff, I think, for students who are just, reading these for the first time. Do you have any thoughts for how we might teach this or break it to them?
Yeah.
I guess we might.
Break it to them. On a very, very practical level, don't start with the Gospels if you teach the New Testament or early Christianity. Just don't do it. I don't know any textbook. Yeah, you just end up reinforcing the exact narrative that we've been talking about this entire conversation. And you create a permission structure for that narrative to become the authorizing narrative for how you imagine this new religious movement develops. It's almost like using Acts as historical documents. You know, we know that that's anachronistic for talking about Paul. To some extent, we use it to fill in the blanks, I suppose, but it's really something that we understand we shouldn't do, right? We have to take these texts on their own terms. So yeah, just don't start with the Gospels. I know pedagogically that there's a benefit to it in the sense that although less now, everybody saw, you know, the Charlie Brown Christmas. They know Linus, you know, goes up and does the speech from Luke. Like everybody knows Baby Jesus, you know, Talladega Nights, Baby Jesus one's the best. Like we all know that, but it brings in pre-knowledge. So that's a pedagogical aim. Everyone knows the figure of Jesus on some level. Not every undergrad, especially if they don't come from a religious background, knows who Paul is. But if you start with Paul and you can demonstrate that the group cohesion is maybe not the best even for Paul. It's not a knock on Christianity. It's just describing the historical circumstances of its development. And then you treat the Gospels as a post-war manifestation of the development of this movement. And then if you just talk about the acts of historical authorship, you know, I can't cover everything in one book. You know, I'm opening a conversation. There are many people who know more than I do about ancient authorship. There will be new studies that come out that I'm sure will, let's say, advance this particular book, if not correct it, right? But at least if you teach from that space, it opens up the conversation for us to move forward out of this spiral of oral tradition, community, reinforcing the gospel narrative, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, on a very basic level, I would say for our undergrads, treat them with the respect of start describing this as a new religious movement outside of contemporary demand and treat it as a historical manifestation by simply going in order of the text.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I'll offer one of my scandalous suggestions for teaching Paul is, if I can get away with it, don't teach Romans, because that is just not what he's doing in most of the letters. He's not laying out systematic theology. So Romans is like the outer liar. So I know people are like freaking out now, but
I actually, well, yeah, I mean, that's what I start with Romans because I'm like, this is his intellectual CV. I use it to actually do one thing that I wanted to mention that just quickly to me is sort of the poster child of my claim that we treat the Gospels as exceptional in the study of the ancient Mediterranean world, which is our translations. So we translate a word like pneuma as spirit when it didn't mean, we don't do that in any other, right? They're all ecclesia as church. You know, we have all these words that we allow theological meaning, anachronistic theological meaning to contain for that terminology in the Greek. And we do it in our textbooks, and we do it in our teaching, and it's in our NRSV, and we perpetuate it. And so we already set up a dynamic there where early Christianity is other in the larger panoply of the ancient Greco-Roman world.
Yeah, I once imagined like this ideal edited volume where everybody took on a word that has been translated just awfully throughout history, like pneuma and you know, pistis and things like that. And it's just we could
that would be so cathartic. Yeah, dunamis. That would be super cathartic. But yeah, my point there just being, yeah, if we allow those things to persist. And, you know, particularly with Paul. So sometimes I start with Romans just to be like, I actually will give them a passage that's one of these convoluted passages where you have to understand the technical meaning of pneuma to even understand what he's talking about. And then I make the students just tell me what this means. And once they realize that Spirit doesn't cover it and that they can't actually make sense of these passages in Romans without it, that's when I can start to tell them what the terminology actually means.
Okay, there's actually a couple more questions about teaching. The first one is about, and this is since one of the chapters actually looks closely at the Satyricon. So the question is, would you recommend pairing the Satyricon with the Gospels in an intro New Testament class?
Hi, Anna. This is an excellent question. I would say the Widow of Ephesus is pretty good. I might teach Trimalchio's Dinner Party and the Widow of Ephesus, if for no other reason but to just demonstrate to the students that these were very common themes and tropes in this literature. Empty tombs, cannibalistic, or we might call Eucharistic meals, somebody predicting their death, roosters are crowing, dividing body and blood, among their followers. That's in Trimalchio's case. The Widow of Ephesus, 3 men crucified and a Roman soldier abandoning his post, and the empty tomb, which is implied afterwards, just to show them that if we're going to do, back to Emily's comment, something that is a little bit more historically grounded for our students and not just repeating theological narrative in an intro class, to show them that these tropes exist, I think would be immensely helpful, especially the empty tomb trope. I think you could also teach about Socrates' death. There have been I think there was I'm trying to remember who edited it now, but there was documents for the study of the New Testament. There was an edited volume that's probably about 30 or 40 years old now, but included some of the Greek novels and some of these other sources. And so I think, yeah, it's one of a number of sources that I think are immensely helpful.
I was going to pull that one down off my shelf too, but I can't.
You know which one I'm talking about. I know mine's at home, so
yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And then there's actually a question about teaching graduate students, asking for a friend, someone. So how would you approach Paul and the Gospels for upper undergraduates or for graduate students?
So for your graduate students, presuming they have German, I would go back to Volkmar, just as one suggestion. I'm not saying this is the way you should absolutely do it. But I would look at some of these alternative theories within German Romanticism instead of just sticking to the sort of Boltzmannian tradition. And I think it would be interesting to see that there have been stages where there are points of rupture from the traditional narrative that we've been talking about. So if your graduate students have German, look at Volkmar. I would actually also encourage, and the reason Volkmar, because he posits this theory that Paul may have been the model for the gospel depictions of Jesus. So that kind of thesis would be very interesting to test. You could also go back to passages that are shared between the Pauline corpus and the Gospels to start to think about how maybe Paul was being used by the Gospel authors. I'm thinking here to Brent Nongri's work on thinking about our sources for early Christianity in the New Testament as a really materialistic concern. How do we think about our actual material artifacts and about these texts as artifacts themselves? We are at a point where we cannot reliably talk about any of these texts, I believe, without actually fully understanding the manuscript tradition for each one. And that too, I think, actually as a corrective to my own book, is something that needs to be looked at in more detail, because to think about the concept of authorship. Again, I want to maintain that my idea of the author here is as a rational actor within a set of social conditions of authorship. That doesn't mean that I think of the author as just like one individual or one person like at their desk, right? There could be more of an amorphous concept of authorship in this case that the manuscript tradition may actually reveal. So these are, in my mind, the next steps for graduate students. And so that kind of comparison with the manuscript tradition, looking at how Paul may have informed these authors, looking at shared material not as a liturgical tradition, but perhaps informed Paul. Anne-Marie Leindijk's work on some of the elements of this corpus that have been preserved in private libraries. How have these documents been used by non-Christians, and evidence for that in the 2nd century and beyond? And how have Paul's letters been engaged by non-Christians within the literary tradition? I think all of these are important questions.
So I think there is one more question that we can fit in here. Another one from Adam Davison. So back to the sort of historical setting of the writing here. If the Gospels were written after a war between Rome and the Jewish people, aided by the Pharisees, I'm not quite sure how that fits in, isn't it a clear motive for producing pacification literature when considering most of the population had turned to Judaism, as stated by Seneca?
I'm trying to parse this question a little bit.
I'm trying to parse it. I think this is an, okay. The Gospels were written.
I think it's trying to say that the Gospels are coming from Jewish writers, perhaps, or from a tradition aligned with Judaism in light of the war.
Right. I mean, definitely which side is doing the pacifying here is an important sort of question or dimension to this.
Right. And also, again, I would just want to emphasize that this idea that there's others have talked about the Hellenism-Judaism divide that tends to persist in our field, that we tend to think of this as a dichotomy, the Romans and the Jews in this period. And I'm not sure, I think we have to trouble that dichotomy for sure, because if we also align the Gospels, I'm not saying don't align the Gospels with Jewish literature. It's something that I think that this question signals, and it's a good topic to bin when we're kind of running out of time. But yeah, I do focus mostly on Greco-Roman literature and not necessarily scripture, Hebrew Bible, or Jewish literature that we might say, and is considered Greco-Roman literature as an umbrella term for both. But I'm also trying to pay more attention to literature that I feel has heretofore been neglected in something like the Satyricon, rather than go back to the Hebrew Bible and that kind of literature. That doesn't mean that I don't sympathize with this question and the idea that the Gospels are aligning themselves with the Judeans, because yes, naturally they are. But I wouldn't I would want to be very careful about the slippery slope of that Hellenism-Judaism divide, imagining these as totally divergent. And I'm not quite sure what the Pharisee clause here indicates, except I will point out, since we've been talking about Paul, that we have really the writings of two Pharisees. We have Paul and we have Josephus. And Josephus is not exactly not part of the Roman elite. Or Philo, right? I mean, he's not a Pharisee, but he's part of.
I actually did want to mention, I guess, just in closing, that one of the good examples that really troubles that you talk about in the book is Philo. And I mean, this idea that there's somehow Judean versus Roman literature. Well, he's a great example of somebody who has got the Paideia. He's also got the Jewish tradition, and out pops something that looks Jewish, but of course it's being informed by, other traditions.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of our only Middle Platonists. If you think about John Dillon's book on the Middle Platonists, his compilation, I mean, Paul should be in there. He's not, but Philo is, because he's one of our only surviving Middle Platonists other than Paul. He's also related to the Roman aristocracy by marriage. So he's not particularly, and Heidi Wendt's work on this as well, I think is important to understand the role that Judeans are playing in the first century world in terms of Roman reception.
Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time here. So I guess just thanks to Robyn for a wonderful conversation. Thanks to everybody who asked questions. And yeah, hope to see you next time we do something like this.
Thank you.